sober since the last day of 1992. And I'm incredibly grateful for that. But what that means to me is I'm incredibly grateful and lucky to be an alcoholic. I had no idea when I came in, but it's through recovery and the program and understanding the spiritual nature of life that everything started making sense. And I was really given a second lease on things. And I'll always be grateful for that, and to AA and to all the people, the kind of people who have helped me. Thank you for having me here. If you want to make AA cool again, maybe you should rethink this, but that's okay. We'll start where we are. I want to thank everybody who's from my various other groups that's shown up in support. It means a lot. I appreciate it. I hope that I do you justice. Now, some of the usual disclaimers and caveats that I'm not a historian. I don't speak for AA. A lot of the content in AA's history has been contradicted, and there are all kinds of people proclaiming that they have the exact knowledge. But the more you look at it, the more you realize that this is taken by faith, that Bill was a great man, and he did his best to document as thoroughly as he could. And the big thing is, it would be like one of us stumbling onto the cure for cancer, some kind of a non-invasive cure, and it works, and he's running around just trying to get the message out and keep this, keep the wheels on this thing as long as he can before something clobbers it. And you could just tell that he was just beside himself, and everybody who touched it. So that's the AA disclaimer. And we're going to defer to the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous as much as possible, unless I think something's funnier and I try to bring it in. And also, my general caveat is, don't listen to me. I could be wrong. Listen to your sponsor. Think of this as entertainment. And what I've tried to do to make this a little more concise is to put a title to this, which is a narrative timeline of AA history from 7 million BC to June 10th or 17th, 1935. Your choice for the actual founder's date. And the theme of this thing is, how can all these various happenstances involved in the intersection of this coming together and finding fruit and being the only program that's shown any validity for the whole of human history? How did it happen with a bunch of disparate, crazy, Vermonters and assorted, other folks? It's just amazing. And as we were talking, I think with Dustin earlier, about how the more you study the history of AA and the more you see the three-dimensional aspects of it, you realize that nobody with 4 years could have written this book, even with the help of the other 99 or however many there were, to come up with something this concise and this advanced. So this brings into the whole theory of synchronicity, which is random events that appear unrelated but actually are. So that was obviously, synchronicity was a phrase coined by Carl Jung, who we're going to talk about in a little bit, and he had a pretty good view on it. I think he's called it the simultaneous occurrence of events which appear significantly related but have no discernible common connection. So the first part of this is, I think it's critical that we break up discussions of AA, even in history, with identification of the precise problem, identification of the precise solution, and how we access that solution. So the first part, once again, this goes back thousands of years. First traces of humans were approximately 7 million years ago. The earliest evidence of alcohol came, about 7 million years ago for humans. The first evidence of alcohol came 7,000 years ago. My question is, what took so long? What were they doing? They should have been at this sooner. King Solomon had a lot to say about this about 1000 BC or 3,000 years ago. I don't know if anybody's paid any attention, but in Proverbs 23, verse 29 to 35, it says, "Who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has strife? Who has complaints? Who has needless bruises? Who has bloodshot eyes? Those who linger over wine, who go to sample bowls of mixed wine, do not gaze at the wine when it's red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. In the end, it bites like a snake and poisons like a viper. Your eyes will see strange things, and your mind will imagine confusing things. You will be like the one sleeping on the high seas, lying on top of the rigging. They hit me, you will say, but I'm not hurt. They beat me, but I felt it not. When you wake up, when can I find another drink? I don't know what the big deal is. It sounds like a Tuesday night to me, but there you go. And then the temperance movement started, and that was, the US, it started about 1737, and it continued through Prohibition in 1939. 1933. One of my favorite Prohibition examples is that's when Dr. Bob started drinking, when Prohibition really hit. So it's pretty funny. One of the great reformers, it's really fascinating to think about. I don't know if y'all have ever heard of Carrie Nation. This was a woman who was about 6 foot tall and looked like a wrestler. And she was known as the Hatchet Granny. And she would have these things called hatchetations. And she would go into bars and go into taverns with her hatchet and just chop them into kindling. And, this is the way that they thought it was the best way to handle these things. Matter of fact, in 1901, the assassination of William McKinley, her comment to the press was, well, that's great. He got what he deserved. He was an alcoholic. So this is more of an example of the general consensus of what the views are, and were about us. I mean, that we were weak-willed, that we were mentally deficient, that we were sinful. And we only had several options back then. We were either going to go to jail or go to an institution of sorts, or we were going to die from the disease. And it's really fascinating to think that from all of human history, there was nothing that went on. You had a few people that were trying. You had a Dr. Benjamin Rush, who in 1784 published a book on alcoholism. He's the first one in the United States. And in it, he said he thought it was a disease, but he didn't have anything else to add, and it didn't go anywhere. About 40 years later, there was a Dr. Thomas Trotter in the UK who wrote another full-length book on AA, thought it was a disease, but didn't have anything else to offer, and it didn't go anywhere. And then the thing that really is just bizarre is you go forward to 1933, and Bill Wilson, for the first time, is meeting, Dr. William Duncan Silkworth in Towns Hospital, and Dr. Silkworth is explaining something that, for what we know, is the first time in human history, he's advancing the concept of a disease model. And he says, I think it's the two-part disease. Physical part's a manifestation of an allergy, and it's a mental obsession. And he went on to, we'll get into some of the specifics of what he said in a little bit, but that was the first time. And he was saying it to the one most random person who you'd never think was going to be able to take this information, which was the problem, come up with a solution, and then have the fortitude to fight all the vagaries and vicissitudes of life to get this thing into a book form, and to then start a worldwide movement where literally millions of people have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body. It really is staggering when you think about it in those terms. Along the way, you had the Washingtonians about 1840. These guys, I think we all know a lot about their history. There were 6 drunks up in Baltimore who decided that they wanted to quit, and they made a pledge, and they were tremendously successful. Over the course of about 7 years, they got up to what's estimated to be somewhere between 150,000 to 600,000 people. But they had some inherent problems, systemic pathology, and within a very short period of time, they completely went away. And so much so that when Bill Wilson was starting to get information about writing the Big Book, somebody brought this up to him, and he didn't even know who the Washingtonians were. And yet, they had Abraham Lincoln speak at one of their topics and one of their meetings, and I think it was in Springfield. And so they were very notable for what they were. They had a lot of celebrity folks. But the point of that is they provided the basis for a couple of our major traditions, which have, been in place, since then. So when Dr. Silkworth was telling Bill Wilson about the problem, Bill Wilson was a chronic alcoholic. from Vermont, was born in East Dorset and was raised in Manchester, which was a resort town where a lot of wealthy people vacationed. You had people like Lois Burnham and her family, who was in the town of Manchester, ended up becoming not only Bill's wife, but also the co-founder of Al-Anon and Alateen. You had Roland Hazard, who's going to play a role in a little bit. You had Ebby Thatcher, who's going to play a role in a little bit. So it was really coincidental that all these people came from from that Manchester area. You even had Dr. Bob Smith from up in St. Johnsbury, Vermont. And that it's a very specific set of criteria that make Vermonters and their view of the world that's different from almost every other section of the country. And it's going to play a real role in what AA turned into be, not only with our, our steps, but mainly in our traditions and in our concepts. So let's jump ahead. We have a guy named Roland Hazard. Roland Hazard, a lot of people date this to the first, section of AA's history. He was a very wealthy Rhode Island magnate. He was a billionaire in today's terms. He came from generations of wealthy, successful people. Matter of fact, over 100 years of people had the exact same name that he did. And they had textiles and chemicals and, manufacturing businesses. I think they even had shipping. He was up in the Rhode Island area, and he was a hopeless alcoholic, and the family sort of assumed that he was going to be able to take over the family business. And he made a run of trying to find, relief here in the United States. And through a family member who'd been to Switzerland and met Dr. Carl Jung, Roland goes over there. And he sits down, he tells Dr. Jung his problem. And matter of fact, there's some contention of when he was over there. The best guess right now is about 1926, but it could have been 31. And in it, he spent approximately a year learning everything that Dr. Jung could teach him. As a matter of fact, when he left, he thought he understood the machinations of his mind perfectly, and he had this covered. Well, Roland got as far, apparently, as Paris, France, was just a couple-hour train ride from Zurich. And somebody asked him a really unfortunate question. They said, "Sir, would you like a drink?" And he goes, "Why, yes, I would." And the next thing he knows, he's flying back to Zurich, and he goes, Dr. Jung, you got to help me again. I don't know what happened. I was doing everything I was supposed to do." Dr. Jung utters the genesis of the identification of the problem, and it's through the words, "You're hopeless. You are a hopeless alcoholic of the mind that we never see correct." Billionaires aren't used to taking no for an answer. So he goes, "Is there not anything I can do?" Dr. Jung goes, "Well, yes. In the annals of psychiatry, there are various incidences of people having vital spiritual experiences and being able to lose their craving for alcohol." And, Roland goes, "Great, I'm a church man." Dr. Jung goes, "Nope, that's not it. This is a complete shift in your ideas, your attitude, and your actions." And so Roland set off to go back to the United States, and he got here, and he was looking for some way to find this. And the United States was going through a revival in the 30s, and they had a group that had taken a lot of positive press and gotten a foothold in the United States called the Oxford Group. And it was started by a Lutheran minister named Frank Buckman out of the UK. And they were very big in New York. They were first century sort of, get back to the concepts of Christianity. They had 4 concepts, and they had 6 steps, which became integral into the AA program later on. So when Roland found him, he actually went through and had the spiritual awakening. And part of the Oxford Group's plan was that you had to carry the message. You had to testify and get out there and do it. So there was a guy named Ebby Thatcher. And Ebby ended up becoming, quote unquote, Bill's sponsor. But Ebby was another guy who'd summered up in the Manchester, Vermont area. And he knew, Bill Wilson, and he and Lois were really good friends. And so Ebby was having a little bit of problem. He was a bad alcoholic, and Ebby's family was very wealthy and successful politically, connected up in the Albany, New York area. And they had paid Ebby to go to Manchester just to keep him away because of his shenanigans. Well, some of the things that he did while up in Manchester were he was driving home one night, like people often do from the bar, having several libations. He somehow mysteriously lost control of his car and drove it into the kitchen of someone's home. This was early in the morning, and Ebby having the presence of thought to ask her for a cup of coffee. And of course, while she was busy calling the police, that just didn't sit very well. The second story is that Ebby was, his brother had asked him to paint the house as sort of, for being up there. And Ebby got up and he was painting it and did a really good job, decided, I did such a good job, I should have a couple of cocktails. So he sits in the yard, admires handiwork, having a couple of cocktails, and all of a sudden some pigeons come by and start to desecrate his painting work, and he's furious. So what does a good alcoholic do? Well, he goes in the house and pulls out not one, but two shotguns, comes in the front yard and starts blasting. And this is in a very affluent, area of Manchester, Vermont. And next thing you know, the police are there. Well, Ebby had three such incidences in his, limited time up in Manchester. So he gets thrown in the pokey, and he is facing 6 months in Battleboro Asylum. Now, I have no idea what Battleboro Asylum is, but I'm just going to assume it's not good. And Ebby, for the first time, was just pretty scared senseless. The judge in the case was a guy named Clinton Graves, I believe it was. And Clinton Graves had a son who belonged to the Oxford group, and it was Shep Graves. And so Shep calls his, or dad talks to Shep calls his buddies, and they go to talk to Roland Hazard. And Roland is not only connected through Vermont, but he's also had the spiritual awakening at the Oxford group. And so they go up and talk to Ebby and explain to him that, they can talk to the judge and see what they can do. They could probably get him released into the custody of Roland Hazard. The judge said, okay, we'll do that if you can stay sober until Monday. This was probably on a Friday or something. So Ebby had to white knuckle it. He was in jail, but had to white knuckle it for a few days in order to get sober in front of the judge. They release him to Roland. Roland takes him back to New York City, and that starts, about 2.5 years of Ebby's sobriety. He'd gone to the Oxford group, had a spiritual awakening, and was taking the, 12-stepping seriously. And he gets reminded of an old drinking buddy of his, Bill Wilson, who's, apparently dying over in his home. So they were in Brooklyn. So Ebby goes over to calls Lois, but it may not be the book's version, but and they set up a dinner and they go over there, and Ebby explains to Bill exactly what the Oxford group represents. Now, the way Bill writes the thing is that Ebby shows up and they're over the kitchen table. Ebby refuses a drink. Bill asks, what's going on? Ebby says, I've got religion. And, Bill is immediately put off and offended because Bill is an agnostic. Matter of fact, we can rightfully say, he says 50% of all the first 100 were agnostic. So we can say that the AA is a program by agnostics for agnostics, but it's turned out to be amazingly spiritual and effective for agnostic conversion, if you will. So Ebby then goes on to explain what it's like, and Bill's intrigued, so much so that Bill keeps on drinking for another few days and ends up thinking about it and decides that he's going to put himself back into Towns Hospital. I'm getting a little confused on the timing here. So in a nutshell, Bill goes back to see Dr. Silkworth. Now, Dr. Silkworth was a Princeton-educated physician trained in neurology, went to NYU Bellevue for his medical school degree and did some other postgraduate work, but he'd lost all his money in the Great Depression of 1929, and he'd taken a job at Towns Hospital in Lower Manhattan, and there he was treating alcoholics and addicts. And it turns out that he had a real gift for it, a real patience for it, and a real heart for it, so much so that they wrote a book about him called The Little Doctor Who Loves Drunks. Matter of fact, AA calls him the basic saint of, medical saint of AA, and his contributions were tremendous. They say that he saw in excess of 40,000, drunks and addicts during his stay, and, was helpful to a lot of them. So that's the first thing. But what Dr. Silkworth explained to Bill Wilson was that we have a two-part disease, physical and mental. The physical part is, when I take a drink, it triggers my allergy. And my allergy, manifests itself as a phenomenon of craving. So the more I drink, the more I want. You can't have the craving without the, introduction of alcohol. But with that, after a point, I can't stop. And then I have all kinds of consequences. And the consequences are what a lot of us judge each other as we come into the program. And it's not that at all. It's, do we have the allergy? Because if we do, we're powerless over it. Now, this would be 100% curable if this was our only problem, because if you don't drink, you won't trigger the craving. So the problem's on the other side. We have a mental obsession. The way it starts is, I will go through or go on a run, and I'll wake up one day and realize how many people I've hurt, all the opportunities I've lost, and just the wreckage of the dumpster fire of my life. And with that, I make a firm resolution. I'm never going to drink again. I am done. And that's where the problems start, because I have been utilizing alcohol as a solution to a lot of my problems. It wasn't the problem of itself. As a matter of fact, when I, restless, irritable, and discontent are some of the issues. And so restlessness, I'm never comfortable in my own skin, discontent, nothing's good enough. And it just, everybody I was swearing to, I was going to be the best, version of myself for, to get, to make amends. Now they're climbing on my last nerve. And when we go through this, which every other human on earth does, that's a problem for us, because we don't react the same way. We have this mental obsession that creeps up that's constantly telling us that we have a solution. You don't have to feel this way. You can take a drink. And the same thing if you're having a great day, don't cheat yourself. You should go celebrate. So that was the genesis of this. And Bill heard all this, and he was just amazed. He did some more drinking, but he came back for his fourth visit to Towns Hospital with a new resolution that he was going to actually give it a try. And from that, he was visited by Ebby again, and Ebby brought him a book of Varieties of Religious Experience by William James, which was apparently very, help shape his views on stuff and give him confidence that what he's experiencing was normal. But Bill had his white light experience. He said, if there's a God, let him show himself. And it's something like out of a science fiction movie, according to Bill. There was a bright light that took over the room, that there was a breeze like from a mountaintop blowing through there. And for a while, he just sat there knowing that he was changed in an entirely different situation. So much so that when he sort of gained normalcy at this, he called Dr. Silkworth and was asking, what in the world happened? Am I crazy? And Dr. Silkworth, which is part of the genius of this, any other doctor, and you might not have gotten this sort of response, but he goes, you're not crazy. I don't know what's happened to you, but you might as well hold on to it. Now, men of science are not really keen to listen to a lot of, sort of psychic changes without trying to label them as something, some kind of crazy condition. But Bill took that, got out of Towns Hospital, and started proselytizing everywhere he could. He felt like that if he had found this cure, and he felt it immediately, that other people would want it too. So he goes to up and down the bars in Bowery, and he's grabbing drunks off bar stools. And it's estimated that he talked to 100 people between December of 1934 and in June or May when he met Dr. Bob Smith in Akron, 1935. So it's not working. Bill is hitting a goose egg on trying to get people to accept this, because he's going in pitching this spiritual conversion as a solution to alcoholism. Well, he goes to his wife, Lois, and he says, I'm done. I'm quitting. Nobody's getting sober. And she looks at him and she goes, you've stayed sober. Go talk to Dr. Silkworth. So he goes back to Dr. Silkworth, and once again, Silkworth was just apparently one of the most even-keeled, caring human beings. And what he says is that don't lead with this spiritual conversion that's probably really difficult for alcoholics to swallow. Go with what I explained to you, which is the hopelessness of the disease. It's the same thing I told Lois, that she was going to have to put you in a home. This was, the thing that really triggered Bill's, involvement to take this seriously. It's what Dr. Young had said to Roland Hazard, and foreshadowing, it's going to be what Bill tells Dr. Smith. The one thing that he did not know was that, and this is an important ingredient of this, is the problem, is understanding the hopelessness and the twofold nature of the disease. So Bill's next day or week was a trip to Akron on a business deal. It was a proxy fight over a rubber manufacturing business in Akron. So he goes out there, he's feeling strong and confident. If it works out, he's going to be the president of it and make a lot of money. So on the trip, he gets there and the deal falls through. He's staying in the Mayflower Hotel, and through the process, he is just shamed by his people. They thought that he should have known better, but apparently they thought they'd won the proxy fight and they counted all this up. But the current CEO of the business apparently had shares in his desk for the winning vote, and whatever it was, he was sort of, I wouldn't say cheated, but it was certainly a surprise. So Bill, took this hard. So he's sitting in the Mayflower Hotel. He says he has $10 in his pocket and no way to pay the hotel bill, no way to get back. And so he starts looking at the bar. It says it's a Saturday night. He's, hearing the music and the gay chatter, and he's starting to fool himself with having a ginger ale. And then, he feels the fear and he remembers, and he goes over to the phone booth and he says, I've got to find an alcoholic to work with, because that's the only thing that's really been effective in helping keeping me sober. And in it, he gets on the phone and, long story short, he reaches a fellow named Reverend Walter Tunks. And Tunks is fascinating. And once again, this whole synchronicity portion of this, he happens to be the fellow who brought the Oxford group to Akron, Ohio. So, and that's a fascinating story, because you had, Mr. Firestone, who actually owned Goodyear Tire Company, had a son named Bud, who was a bad alcoholic. And through a connection with a bunch of people, he ends up getting hooked up with the Oxford group. Bud gets sober, and Mr. Firestone is exceptionally grateful. And he brings a tremendous group of Oxford people, thousands of them literally, to Akron to celebrate. And that's where people like Henrietta Seiberling and some Ann Smith and some of the other people got introduced to the Oxford group. So when Bill gets there, he reaches Dr. Tonks, who sends him to something else, and then he reaches this woman, Henrietta Seiberling, and she's actually the divorced wife of Mr. Firestone. He was Fred Firestone that she was married to. And she had been in the Oxford group for a couple of years, and she had a friend named Ann Smith, and Ann's husband was a hopeless alcoholic. He was a physician in Akron. He was a smart guy, gone to Dartmouth and a couple other places. As a matter of fact, he graduated from medical school at Rush College outside of Chicago. And Rush was named for Dr. Benjamin Rush, who is one of the big reformers that we talked about earlier and written the treatise on alcohol. So Dr. Bob thinks that no one knows about his problem. And he's sitting there, just losing his practice, losing his friends, and losing his mind. So he's viciously hungover because I think Bill called and it was Mother's Day in 1935. And Ann Smith says, well, it's Mother's Day. He bought me a potted plant, but he's potted underneath the table right now. I'll see if I can get him over tomorrow. And so on the way over there tomorrow, he doesn't want to go. He's hungover. He's feeling terrible. And it's a dinner at the Seiberling's house. And so he's saying, 15 minutes of this is all I'm going to listen to, and then I'm out of here. He made everybody swear that that was the case. And even his two kids, they went with him, were, Sue and Smitty, the bun, were all saying, yeah, that's what Dad said. It was 15 minutes. Well, Bill meets Dr. Smith and says the magic words, geez, you look like you could use a drink. So 6 hours later, they leave the house with Dr. Smith for the first time meeting someone who understood the alcoholic problem from a first-person perspective. Now, the amazing thing about this is Dr. Smith, obviously a physician, he'd studied everything he could about alcoholism, as he said, and he'd been in the Oxford group for a couple of years. He'd been praying the solution that Bill ultimately found. If this isn't some sort of serendipitous, occasion, I just don't know. The missing link is what Bill told him, which was the hopelessness of the situation. And as Dr. Bob said, that was what triggered him to go back at this with an intensity and a ferocity he didn't have before. And he had the beginning of a spiritual experience there. And he stayed sober for several weeks until I think it was, mid-June of 35. And he has an annual convention, of proctologists in Atlantic City. Can only imagine, second only to a Shriners convention. Could that not be some kind of crazy party? Bunch of proctologists running around all tooted up. But he gets on the train to go. And as he says, I drank all the scotch on the train. He made no pretext. He said, I got off the train and I bought bottles of scotch and I went back, and apparently he made it to one or two meetings and he just had to. And then he just threw his hands up and just committed to get Strauss. So he gets on the train to go back home, and he's so loaded, he can't find his way home. So he ends up at his nurse's house. And so finally they call Bill and Ann. And Bill goes to pick him up. I meant that was an interesting conversation. Hey, Ann, where's your husband? Well, he's at your nurse's house sleeping it off. Okay. So anyway, Bill goes and gets him. They bring it home. Bob suffers for 3 days with, the withdrawals. And then on the 10th or the 17th of June, 1935, depending on who you're reading, Dr. Bob wakes up and says, I'm going to do this thing. And Bill thought that he was talking about the surgery that he had to do in a couple of hours on some, unsuspecting patient. And Dr. Bob was talking about really give in, because Dr. Bob believed a lot of the principles of the cure, but did not understand the real commitment to go through and make amends, do your 9th step. He felt like that if he do that it would be an absolute disaster for his practice. And he was full of pride. So, but anyway, that morning they put him in the car, they dress him up. They go to the Akron City Hospital. They let him out up front, and Bill gives him a beer and what Bill calls a goofball. And so here he is, loaded, going into the OR and performing the delicate backside surgery on this poor victim. And apparently the surgery turned out well. There were no death reports of this whatsoever. So then Dr. Smith disappears. And they're all expecting the worst. Dr. Smith is in some kind of, he's in a bush somewhere, just, boiled as an owl. And, but it turns out later that evening, he comes home and he says that he has been going around making all his amends, doing the things necessary to stay sober. And that was the beginning of the friendship. That was the day that Dr. Bob took his last drink, and whether it was the 10th or 17th is irrelevant, but that marked the beginning of his drinking career. He went another, I think he lived 15 more years. And they say that Dr. Bob sponsored, 4,000 or 5,000 people during his career. And if you run the math on that, that's a tremendous commitment to this. And Dr. Bob was really sort of the backbone and the heart of this fellowship. And in fact, I think it was Ruth Hawk, Bill's secretary in New York, that said, she said, without I think she said, if Bill was at this alone, they would have franchised the thing and there'd be tens of thousands of locations. And if Dr. Bob had run the thing, it would still only be in Akron. So apparently it was just this real beautiful friendship. And Bill considered Dr. Bob his best friend up until the end. So then the process, starts interesting. We're getting up to about 1935, obviously. And I'm going to touch on the solution part, because that's what was really touched on by the Oxford group. And in it, we talked about the four absolutes that they had, which were honesty, unselfishness, love, and purity. And then talked about their 6 steps, which were complete deflation, dependence on God, a moral inventory, confession, restitution, and to continue to work with others in need. And so with that, you had, Roland Hazard, Ebby Thatcher, Dr. Bob, and, Bill was trying to get this thing going. Then within 2 days, Bill and Dr. Bob had called up Akron City Hospital and the Sister Ignatia that had been there for a long time. And most hospitals in those days were very loath to take on alcoholics because it was fruitless. They did not get better. They were constantly dying. They weren't paying their bills, and it was just a mercy they felt like they should forego. But he calls and he asks her if she's got anybody, and she goes, "Oh yeah, we got a real corker. We got an attorney, a very prominent attorney who's just beat up a nurse, and we've got him strapped down as we speak." So they put him in a single room, and Dr. Bob and Bill go to see him the next day. And it turns out this guy's named Bill Dotson, and he is an attorney, and he's, all indications are he's a hopeless attorney. He becomes AA number 3, the picture of the man in the bed when the 2 guys in the suits are sitting there looking at him. He's in a t-shirt and looking all, deflated. Well, that's apparently Bill Dotson. And he makes a stunning recovery. He has long-term, actually to the end, sobriety, and he becomes a real presence in the Akron group. Akron became a very spiritual component of AA. They were, because the Oxford group really stressed a lot of the first century Christian beliefs. And matter of fact, before they wrote the book, they were all studying the book of James and First Corinthians and some other things. And so that really made us stick. Bill stayed there for the rest of the summer, and Lois comes out to visit for a couple of weeks, and she really likes Anne, and they're doing well, but they're broke. Everybody is broke. And so Bill goes back to New York and tries to set up something. His first person in New York that he gets a call from Towns Hospital is a fellow named Hank Parkhurst. And he goes in there, and Hank is, a fellow who's was once very successful and worked for Standard Oil and managed thousands of people, but alcohol had taken its toll. And Hank was just at the end of his ropes and suicidal. And Bill came to see him, and they did the standard thing where they went in and just talked about their experience. Didn't try to convert anybody, just told them about the hopelessness of the condition and talked to them, one-on-one, that they understood what the people were going through. And that was a real breakthrough moment. And this is a real part of the foundational thesis of our program, that we will not listen to the frothy emotional appeal of loved ones or well-intended diagnoses by white-coated professionals, but a person well armed with the facts about himself can gain the confidence of another alcoholic in a short period of time. And that's what works. We will listen to each other. Now let's jump ahead. Bill had some success. He had, I said Hank Parkhurst. Hank was a real active salesman, and Hank was very instrumental in helping Bill get the book published. Bill decided they had about 2 more years. It was 37, 38. And they were struggling to figure out what they could do to promote this. They had the Rockefeller dinner, I think in 1940. And with that, John D. Rockefeller, it's a long story how they actually got in there. But, he listened to him. He sent a fellow to investigate, you know, the program in Akron as well as in New York. And he was, you know, just amazingly surprised that this was everything that it said it was. And we keep coming back to the same point. In human history, there had not been a reliable treatment cure for alcoholics. So this was literally just sort of, you know, like right up there with, oh, I just saw an alien on Fifth Avenue. And so once they believed it, they were all just going, humanity needs this. Well, Rockefeller was pretty smart, obviously, and he made the comment that money would kill AA. Matter of fact, John D was not at the dinner. It was actually Nelson, you know, who had his own special career. But they told him that money would just, self-funding was the only way to go. You couldn't be beholden to anybody else. They'd be calling the shots. And part of the integrity of AA gets back to the democracy. I just got the hook.
You want to give us the conclusion? You're good, man. You're on a roll.
I'm going to stare you down like Clancy. I'm good. All right, let me finish this. The point of this whole thing is not to go over a lot of the history that you can read in books and pamphlets. It's to understand that this should not have happened. Anything in history, you can look backwards and you can see the connecting links and go, oh, that's the way it happened. But let's look at this realistically. Nobody in human history had done this before. And you would not have picked any of these people to be your components of this great invention. And the fact that there are millions of us here that are testimonials to how this thing works. And we even talked about, it's not about not drinking, it's about the spiritual experience. Because in my definition, AA 101 is not drinking. AA 102 is when you enter the world of the spirit. And if you keep doing 10, 11, and 12, which is not just AA's relapse prevention plan, but it's the fuel and the growth for the rest of your life, you start seeing miracles. And then you see a redemption, because all the pain and suffering, shame, guilt, and remorse that you went through is being used to help other people, that God is prepared to hear the message only from you. And you experience that, and you just are completely blown away by the symmetry of all this. And especially for all the few young people on the call, that the more you review this, it's worthy of your time and your investigation. It could not deepen your faith in a higher power any more than that. How's that, Dustin?
That was great. Could everyone, I'm going to ask you guys to unmute the whole time. Like, can we get
way to go, buddy? Way to go.
That was amazing.
Nice work, Yale.
Yale, I think we're going to have to invite you back for the second half.
1935,
right?
2022.
I think we're going to have to invite you back. We cut that short. 1 sec.